Welcome to the tutorial Editing a Sound File. So to edit a sound file in Animate or Animate Pro, you have to use the sound editor, or sometimes referred to as the sound element editor. So you can bring up the sound editor in several ways. You can double click on a layer, or you can click on the sound editor button from the layer properties window. So there's several parts to the sound element editor. The first part is the sound element, the second part is the current sound, and the third part is the lip sync section. So to see a waveform in the current sound section, you actually have to click on the waveform in the sound element section. So the difference between the two is that the sound element houses the edited sound that will appear in your animation. So whatever you do to your sound file, you'll see the results here. The current sound is the actual complete sound file. So this is something to think about when you bring a sound file into Animate or Animate Pro. The fact that you can always see your complete sound file gives you a clue that the file carries around the complete sound file with it. So if it's a very heavy wave file, for example, even cutting it down in Animate or Animate Pro will not actually cut down the file size. So there are several things that you can do in the sound element editor. The first one being changing the start and end frames of a sound. So you do this in the sound element section, and you do this by grabbing the two flags. Currently you can only see the first one, the green flag, which indicates the start frame. So right now it's at frame 1, but if you click on it and drag, you can bring it, say, to frame 12. So now your sound will start on frame 12. And if you scroll all the way to the end, the sound currently ends on frame 138, but you can drag it so that it ends on, say, frame 31. And then if we grab the sound element editor and drag it upwards, you can see that this sound file now begins at frame 12 and ends at frame 31. So another thing you can do in the sound element editor is trim the start and stop frame of your sound file, and you do this in the current sound section. So what we did above here in the sound element section was decide the position of our sound sample within our project file. So let me extend this back to nearly the full length of the sound file. So something like that, and let's have it start at frame 1 again. And then here at the bottom, what we could do is drag the flags to shorten the sample. So now the sample only exists from, let's say, the 5 or the 0.5 second mark. So even though it starts at frame 1, it's starting at 5 seconds into the song or the sound sample. And then if we drag this to frame 20, then what's going on is that the 5-second mark where this sound sample starts now begins at frame 20. And of course you can play your sound sample in both these windows, so you can listen to it in the sound element window by pressing play. It ends where you see this sound wave stop right here, so around 48. And I might actually bring this to the end of the sound. And you can also play it down here. And then of course if I drag this yellow flag, I can make the sound sample available from the source file much smaller. And as you also may have noticed, if you move the flags in the current sound section, it also affects the flags in the sound element section and vice versa. And this makes sense because in the sound element section you're dealing with position, and in the current sound section you're dealing with time, and those two things are related. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is how to loop a sound. So the one limitation of the sound element editor in Animate or Animate Pro is that you cannot loop the edited version of your sound. So the only thing you can loop is your complete sound file. So if I enter a number here in the number of loops field, such as 3 and hit enter, you'll see that this entire sound sample gets repeated 2 more times. And you can tell that they've been repeated because they are the waveforms in gray. And you can always use the zooming here to zoom in to see your sound file in more detail, or zoom out once more. And you can always click on Apply Next to see that actually applied in the timeline. So I'm going to close this, and we can see that this waveform in its full extent has been repeated 3 times. And although it holds its position at starting at frame 20, it doesn't keep the edits that I made in terms of its length. So let's go back to the sound element editor, but this time I'll show you how to do it with the X sheet. Just like with the timeline, where you can double click on a layer to bring up the sound element editor, you can double click on the header of a sound column in the X sheet. So this time I'm using a different sound, the cartoon drum loose snare. I can play it to let you hear what it sounds like. And my intention was to overlay this sound with the other sound to make this fighting cloud appear like it's a noisy fighting cloud with all sorts of things being thrown out and hitting the floor. So what I wanted to show you for this sound is how to mix the sound volume, as they call it, or add fade-ins or fade-outs to the sound envelope. So something that's a little strange is that you do that in the current sound window here, but in fact you're not affecting the original file in any way. You're really going to be adding that fade-in and fade-out to the sound sample that will appear in your project. Let me just bring this flag a little closer so we can work with a smaller sample. And I'm always trying to find a logical place, like where the sound might taper, so that it doesn't sound like a blunt cut in the sound. And you have to be careful because sometimes you're dragging the flag and sometimes you're dragging the entire sound down the timeline. Okay, so just something like that, for example. So we have something small to work with. So what I want to do is fade in to the sound and then fade out of it. So to do that, I don't know if you can see there's a little white box attached to the blue line here for both of these 2 sound channels. And the reason that we see 2 sound channels is because this sound exists in stereo. So one is for the left ear and one is for the right ear. So whatever you do to one channel, you should usually do to the other channel. So by adding another keyframe or something that's similar to a keyframe, you just have to tap on the blue line and another white box appears. And what we're doing is that we're going to drag this down if we want there to be a fade in. It looks like I actually created our first 2 keyframes, so let me create 2 more. And now what we want to do is drag our first 2 keyframes down. And then obviously if we want a fade out, we'll place these keyframes in the opposite formation. So like that. And now if we play our sound sample loop, I don't know if you can hear it, but I can. So it goes from low to high and then high to low. So that's how you would fade in or out a sound. So I'm going to close that without applying and then go back to the timeline. So what I really want to take a look at now is how you can move sound around in the timeline. So you don't necessarily have to have one sound sample per layer. These 2 sounds can exist on the same layer. So I can actually select a place on the timeline, hold down Shift, select the end of that sound sample, and then drag that piece down to a different layer. Okay, apparently unless they are looped. So looped sound clips cannot be dragged or copied. So I'm going to say okay. So what I'm going to do instead is use this one down here. Let me just undo that so that this reappears. And I'm going to take a part of this song and drag it up here instead. There we go. So you can see that it moves around. And something else that I wanted to mention is that these two fields here in the layer properties for the selected sound layer should not really have these arrows or be editable or writable because they're really just read only. This now tells us that this sound sample starts at frame 29 and effectively ends at frame 127, which is down here for the rest of the sound sample. So because we split this, it's a little weird. It knows that it starts at frame 30 here because that's where the start of the song is, but this entire song ends with our scene ends where this bracket is, and that's at frame 127. If we did that here, we see that our sample starts at frame 20 and it ends at frame 106. So this looped frame, we might not be able to see it because the sound wave disappears, but it probably effectively goes till about here where there's a full fade out of sound. So that's how we know the length of our sounds. So then if we open up the sound editor for this sound where there are two separate sound samples in the same layer, you'll see that the editor understands that they were not taken from the same sound file, and that's because, as you know, the project retains the original sound file, so it knows that this is coming from one file and that this is coming from one file. And in this case, the second part is coming from an MP3 and this is a WAV file, so it really does understand that there's a distinction. And so another thing that you can't really do is you can't overlap two sound samples. So this flag can only be dragged to frame 27 because this sound sample ends at frame 26. And I wanted to show you this because it leads me into my next topic. So I'm going to close this, and I'm actually going to undo till I bring that back. And that's how to create an empty sound layer. When you're doing lip syncing, which we're going to get into later on, you might have your character move views. So its head might be in the profile position to start, then it might turn while it's talking into the 3/4 position, for example, then turn back to the profile position. So every time your character changes views, it needs a separate layer for the sound. If you want to apply lip syncing to it, you can't lip sync this sound layer. In other words, add mouth positions to specific phonemes. This might not make sense to you, and it will after you've watched the video for lip syncing. But if you want to take the first part of the speech with the head position at a 3/4 profile, and then you want to turn the head halfway in between, for the rest of the speech, this part of the sound file with dialogue then needs to be moved to a different layer. And so what you would do first is create an empty sound layer, and you could do this in several ways. One way being going to the Add Layer button in the timeline view and clicking on Sound. So now you have an empty sound layer. There's also a button that you can add to the end of the timeline view toolbar, and you can do this by right-clicking on the toolbar and selecting Customize. Then by selecting Add Sound, adding it to your toolbar, clicking Apply, and then by saying OK. So now you have this button that you can click to add another empty sound layer. And these empty sound layers also exist as columns in the Xsheet view. So they're the two here at the end. So what you can do now that you have an empty sound layer is, if you know that your character is going to be in its 3/4 profile view from frame 7 to, say, frame 20, and then from frame 21 to frame 40 it's going to be talking from the front view, you can pull this down so there's a precise cut, and there will also be a precise change in views at this point. But before you do any of this, which I forgot to mention but you should definitely do, it's often a good idea to duplicate the original sound file. So let me just undo for a minute. And before I drag that piece down, what I would do is duplicate this file. And you can do that by right-clicking on it and selecting duplicate selected layers. And so one would be your safety, and the other one you would use to cut up between 2 or 3 sound layers, so maybe one for the front view, one for the profile view, and one for the 3/4 view, or however many different views you switch between. And of course, if your character's head moves back to the front view or back to a view that's already here, you can just drag those sections to the layer allotted for that view. So that's it for the tutorial, editing a sound file. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, lip sync.